here we are. We are going to be dealing with the Trump plan because this was just presented and seems like deja vu in Gaza. Is it viable or is it just a pause, a Hudna? Oslo, maybe there's jihadi sabotage this time. We're going to take a very close look. And yes, we can expect some intensified anti-Semitism. Now, 30 years passed, and how is it that the most right-wing government in the history of the state of Israel has essentially adopted the plan that they rejected 30 years ago and constantly condemned those who had moved it forward? So without further ado, as we say, here we go. Okay, so first we need a little bit of background. We spoke about Oslo, and I'm sure not everybody remembers it. Not everybody, is teaching this all the time and dealing with it. Oslo, the process, it was a process, 93 to 2000, and now the return, 25 years later. Success, failure, it was based on the 1979 Camp David Accords, which Menachem Begin signed, if you remember, right, with Jimmy Carter there and Anwar Sadat. Part of it was peace with Egypt. Another part was Palestinian autonomy. 14 years later, Yitzhak Rabin, you see in the picture here with Yasser Arafat and Bill Clinton, used those same accords signed by Begin as his baseline in order to move things towards what would become the Palestinian autonomy, or the Palestinian Authority would be led by Yasser Arafat. Himself would have been a terrorist, but now he said he was committed to peace. We know that didn't exactly work out. So there are a lot of international resolutions. We're not going into them. There was a lot of frameworks and underpinnings to try to make this happen in Oslo. And what was the general understanding in Israel? The Zionist understanding was that, right, and that's Jewish nationalism, is that nation state ensures the continuation of a people's existence. It's a European concept that the nation state does it. And therefore, that's why you need nation state, to ensure it's a vessel, it's a tool to ensure your continued existence as a people. So the one state solution was rejected. Otherwise, they're a binational state. And for all you know, in a binational state, right, one side becomes larger than the other, and it's a never-ending civil war. Take a look at a place like Lebanon, although that's a multinational state. It leads to a lot of chaos and disaster in a mixed state. And we have lots of examples: Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and the Yemen civil war, even though they're all Yemenite, but one is Sunni and the other is Shiite. So you don't want to draw on outside parties to continue this. The idea would be, let's separate out, two-state solution. Okay? And that was the Israeli thinking on it. Others said this is a fairly dangerous way of doing it. So let's take a look. Okay, so when you have, in the year 2000, everything fell apart, right? Those of us in the older generation, I think all of us remember that in December of 2000, Bill Clinton presented his parameters. That's after you had the explosion of what's called the Second Intifada that began at the very end of September in the year 2000 itself. What did Clinton suggest? Okay, it's after the failure that summer of Camp David 2000, as it's known. All of Gaza and 94 to 96% of the West Bank goes to the Palestinians. There'll be land swaps. And the idea was 80% of the Jews living across the Green Line, meaning in the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, remain in Israel. And you, with these land swaps, you're able to make sure that Israel remains Jewish and the Palestinian areas remain Palestinian Arab. There also had to be security cooperation, which is written about here, a non-militarized Palestinian state, or what some people call demilitarized. Issues of the borders and the settlements and what I just mentioned had to be negotiated. And the whole issue of Palestinian refugees, right? UN Resolution 194 from 1948, where would they live, right? If they're going to be refugees coming back, the idea was they're not coming back to Israel, but they'll live in a Palestinian state. Moving right along, Jerusalem was a big issue they didn't quite solve. And Clinton writes about it, that it was very frustrating. But one of the principles was that it will be a divided city, a borough system, Arab neighborhoods and Jewish neighborhoods. If you're Arab, you're in a Palestinian state, Jewish in Israel. The old city, could you split it? And he called it the hellish problem of Jerusalem. That was his famous line. And what do you do with the Western Wall, right? The Kotel, and the Temple Mount? Well, the idea was the Western Wall area, Jewish, Temple Mount, it would be Palestinian Arab, but everybody has access to everything. and declare the end of conflict. That was the biggest issue. And what is the big trade-off here? When we look at this globally, no Palestinian right of return, but no Israeli annexations. In other words, the borders from 1967, the same land mass is kept on both sides. Okay, so 22% with the Palestinians and 58% with Israel. Moving right along, previous plans. And I know I'm doing this fairly quickly because some of this we've gone over before and people do have background. If they have questions, can always ask me. Previous plans, Oslo, right? And then Trump, land swaps, and demilitarization. So we actually have Oslo, it's since 1993, it says, but that is Oslo 2, the last time that there was an agreement with maps and it was actually implemented. And you had some 29% of the Palestinian territories ruled by the Palestinian Authority. Part of those territories, Israel still had security responsibilities. On the left, you have the Trump plan, and he mentioned it now in his revised plan. This is from 2020, but in the plan today, which is known also as the Trump-Blair plan, Tony Blair, he mentions it that it's a basis. So I say take a good look at this map on your left, and that could be the basis of an agreement that Trump wants to put out on the table. Now, he didn't, this plan today, 25, he didn't accompany it with any maps. Right. Hamas opposes all this, as we know. The Hamas Covenant of 1988, which has never been canceled. People say, oh, it's been canceled. There's now another agreement. There isn't. We're going into that in a moment. 1988, eternal theological document, the Charter of Allah. It's like a download from God. Not like, it is. That's what's given. Jews are the enemy. It's in the preamble. Full global jihad. That's in Article 8. And that is the slogan of the Muslim Brotherhood. All right, about dying for the jihad. I suggest everybody get to know it quite well, because wherever you have jihadis, that's their slogan. Okay, kill Jews is in Article 7. It's taken from Hadith. Lands captured by Islam belong to Islam forever. We've discussed this somewhat before. And never have compromises or peaceful solutions. Forbidden. And Camp David Accords are condemned. Any peace agreement is condemned. And they mentioned the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that viciously anti-Semitic document that's a forgery by the Russian secret police in 1903. They mention it, that it's truth, and that's why they're functioning in the way they do. The political document of 2017, Article 20, which is said to be moderate, okay, and I suggest people read that as well. And it's kind of long, 40, I think it's 40 different clauses. But Article 20 speaks of the destruction of Israel in stages. In other words, there'll be a temporary West Bank and Gaza Palestinian state, but there has to be full refugee return. And then afterwards, Israel is to be wiped out, the liberation of Palestine. In other words, you're speaking about Israeli extermination in 2 steps. And there are people out there saying, look, they become moderate. They're willing to accept Israel as a state. They don't read the sentence before it speaks of that temporary arrangement, and they don't read the sentence afterwards, or the entire document for that matter. Okay, and constantly hear this nonsense. So Hamas is totally opposed. Okay, what about from the Israeli side? We know just before Donald Trump arrived here, Bezalel Smotrich, who is the Minister of Finance in Israel today from the National Religious Party, far right-wing party with messianic understandings, all right, he has had an annexation plan, all right, and presented it a few days before Trump put out his plan and arrived in Israel. And he said to keep 82% of Judea and Samaria, in other words, West Bank, and that 18% would go to the Palestinians, and those are the yellow areas indicated here. The map is all in Hebrew. Those yellow areas are, Jenin, Nablus, Tolkarm, Jericho, Ramallah, and the Hebron regions. Okay, and they'll just have autonomy. There's no independent state. So it was a question, would they leave the coalition if you'd have a plan like this? It's an Oslo plan, essentially, forced on the Israeli government. Well, there's a lot of internal politicking here, and they're still in the government. They've made lots of threats, but the question is, what options do they have, except the present government that they are in? Now, how fast will this plan be implemented? We'll leave that for a few slides from here, right? The plan in Israel, let's say that Smotrich, his National Religious Party, and Ben-Gvir, his Otzma Yehudit, or Jewish Power Party, leave the coalition. Who will support this plan if there's to be a vote in the Knesset? Eventually, we imagine there needs to be. Well, certainly the opposition will support it. So what we find here is another question. What happens if Israel supports it and Hamas delays or doesn't agree to the plan? Well, they say that they're willing to agree to the plan. The first part of it is not very clear, but they do delay it. Notice just today there were lots of ceasefire violations and Israel responded. So clause 17 is extremely important. And it reads here, I'm quoting, in the event Hamas delays or rejects this proposal, the above, including the scaled up aid operation, will proceed in the terror-free areas handed over from the IDF to the ISF. The ISF, the International Stabilization Force, made up of moderate Arab countries, along with quite possibly Western nations, army representatives as well. Clause 19 speaks of a Palestinian state to be established after the Gaza reconstruction and the Palestinian Authority reform. As you remember, Trump would not allow for members of the Palestinian Authority to come to the UN for the debate in September. Why? He said they have to change two major issues. One, there's the pay for slay, where Palestinian Authority pays those in jail for having killed Israelis. They pay their families. And the other one is that they have a very anti-Semitic educational system. And he said all that has to change. So there has to be a reform, a deep reform. It is very important that that was put into the plan. Okay, but let's say all that's fulfilled. What would happen? Let's take a look here at who makes the decisions in Israel. Well, we go back to Oslo in the 1990s and up to 2000, the Zionist left and center have been decimated. They've been very discredited by the Oslo Accords of the 90s because, remember, there was the intifada of the early 2000s, 2000 to 2004, 5, and people said a lot of instability because of this Oslo Accords. So today, there's barely any left center in Israel. Maybe they have 15, 20 seats if there would be elections today. They can and would support a peace agreement, but it has to come down to the right wing. And here you see a picture of Ariel Sharon. He is the one who was engaged with the Gaza disengagement, leaving Gaza completely in 2005. And we know there had been a lot of attacks against the Jewish settlements that were there and tunneling even under Israeli army positions. So he said, this is an impossible situation, and we have to get out. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu was in that government. He eventually would quit and took over the Likud when Sharon went and built a centrist party. In any case, the unified right in the 1990s and later on would continue to oppose the Oslo Accords. Where Sharon went, yes, I'll give them Gaza. We don't need it. We're not going to be able to use it. Of course, all this rolls into what eventually would be the militarization of Gaza to the point where we ended up with October 7th. Now, one other point, there is this argument between inside the right wing, between what we call theocentric messianism, in other words, God-driven messianic ideas, not to leave any part of the land of Israel, and what's called anthropocentric security concerns, anthropocentric meaning driven by logical deductive reasoning. There are logically a lot of security problems out there, but we have to leave the left and center behind. They don't mean anything, okay? The argument goes on the right, and it's only the right that will be elected and will be making decisions. Okay, so let's go to the plan now. Now, let's remember something. Donald Trump is not exactly someone from the left wing. He's a Republican president. And there are three stages: immediate, interim, and permanent status agreement. So very briefly, okay, the ceasefire, Israel's supposed to eventually withdraw. Today, Israel holds 58% of Gaza. Hostages returned first, which was a very good idea. The problem is and Netanyahu faced this, is that once you're promised something like that and it goes through, okay, you're very happy, but you have to sign on something in the future. And he signs on a Palestinian state, yes, with a lot of conditions, but it's written there in any case. Okay, and Israel had to release 1,700 Palestinian prisoners plus 250 terrorist murderers with life sentences. The other prisoners are there also for security violations, but not the life sentences. Some of those released have multiple life sentences. Okay, there's a stipulation: Hamas must decommission their weapons. I like how that's written. In other words, they have to not be armed. All right, renounce terror. Look, you can say anything you want, and then they'll be allowed to, continue with their lives there. This Israeli withdrawal, okay, step by step. Palestinians can remain in Gaza or come back. In other words, that whole Trump Riviera plan is out, completely out. They're not being removed. All right, it was a ridiculous plan from the outset. I wrote about it plenty. I spoke about it plenty. And now here we are, right? The aid levels from January 25 are to be reinstated. That was right before Israel's latest operation, when actually aid levels were cut. Hamas had managed to steal a lot of the aid, but there was enough for 3 months. People forget that. From March through May, there was enough supplies for 3 months. Right? And then we go back to now clause 17, okay, about the International Stabilization Force can take over any areas where Israel has captured from Hamas and turn it over to the international force that can then begin giving more aid, even more that in general, and rebuilding Gaza. Okay, and that's very, very important, because this is an incentive for Palestinian Gazans to move out from under Hamas control and into areas that are much safer and can rebuild your life. So here we have the map, okay, which I've been speaking about. Here's the 58% yellow and the 42% still held by by Hamas and other terrorist groups. So interim period, and you're to have a Gaza transitional government led by Tony Blair, right? There's partnering Europe, the Arabs, and a whole program put together that nobody's written it up specifically yet. And Gaza is to be rehabilitated. Also, all these reforms take place. There's no date given, which is the problem, because they can go on forever. And we imagine that Israel's government said, don't give it a date. Just, there is a whole issue there of Netanyahu and Trump being good friends, and there'll be elections, right, in another year from now. Okay, so there may be a demand that there's no Hamas rule, but maybe Hamas goes away in name, but they still have a lot of people that believe in what they want to do. That's a jihadi takeover, right, of the world, but starting with Israel. There's supposed to be a lot of oversight, a new policing force. We'll see what happens with the very, very beginning stages. Here's the interim area. Okay, Hamas and their rejection, and I find it very interesting because I went over a lot of material here. A lot of this could have been done 1.5 years ago. In other words, any area Israel captured, Israel could have partnered with international, call it alliances that we had previously, certain with Europe and the modern Arab countries that were willing to work with Israel, but it wasn't done. And I say, did we really miss something here? Because when we look at this plan, a lot of these ideas were sort of like out there already. Like, let's start drawing power away from Hamas, meaning those areas that they don't control. There's no more war, and there's ample food, and there's reconstruction going on. Well, I bring that up. Not everything that is said now is so new. These ideas were out there. Okay, so permanent status agreement. Now, here you have Mahmoud Abbas, president of the Palestinian Authority. That needs to be reformed. So, what are parts of the other permanent status? Israel's not to bomb Qatar ever again. We're going to get to Qatar and Turkey in a few moments. The population has to be de-radicalized. So there's this whole issue of degrade, destroy, and delegitimize. We've gone over this many times, right? I have in things written and people who know the Neeman Academy, that the idea you can degrade and destroy like was done to the Islamic State Caliphate in Iraq and in Syria, but you have to delegitimize jihad educationally. That is a 25 to 30 year process because they'll just keep coming back at you, right? And speaking of a reform program, what does it really mean? We mentioned the pay to slay, and the idea is that there will be a thriving Palestinian state where Gaza and the West Bank are connected by a road, something of which was actually written up already in the Oslo Accords, that concept, if you want, of that the two territories are connected. And we know that there were maps drawn up here and there of where the road would go and how it would be dealt with by previous thinkers. And then as the Accords were being hashed out, but of course, we never got to conflict resolution, right? What's the biggest problem here? And I've gone through this, and it's worse than Oslo. There's no Israeli security enforcement mechanism. In Oslo, it was hinted at, but then in 2004, an exchange of letters between Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon and President George W. Bush, when Israel went and disengaged from Gaza, what Sharon asked for and received was a letter of guarantees. And one of the points there is that Israel has the right to pursue terrorism wherever. Now, during the Oslo Accords, Israel still had security control. Sharon was talking about, okay, in the aftermath, because he would be leaving Gaza. The point is, Bush said, of course, stop terrorism, to preempt it, stop it whenever. Okay, very important point that's missing here, at least at the moment. Many say the whole thing hasn't been hashed out completely. Okay, so we have the Trump conditional endorsement of two-state solution. So Netanyahu was against it, but he had to support the plan. In essence, Israel had no more allies, not in Europe, not moderate countries in the Middle East, not even the American Democratic Party. We're not going to go into Israeli internal issues, but rather the bets were on Trump would take care of this and do it the way that Netanyahu and his coalition wanted. It did not turn out that way. I want to make it very clear because the Americans have their own interests, and that includes the Arab Middle East, Muslim world in general, and lots of money, oil, natural gas. We know that from the Persian Gulf, in particular, the relationship with Qatar. Now, conditions. Gaza be de-radicalized. Here are the quotes, okay? Not be a threat. Hostages returned, we spoke about before. Trump 2020 peace plan and the Saudi-French plan, which, by the way, is the background to what happened at the UN, right? And that meant for the Palestinian Authority to take control of everything after the reform. So in other words, what did Trump do here? He integrated the Saudi-French plan with American demands for certain changes and guarantees, which of course it would be good for Israel. But the question is whether Israel, this government, wants a two-state solution. Okay, the aid through the International Stabilization Force, and here I quote, is critical to prevent munitions from entering Gaza and to facilitate the rapid and secure flow of goods to rebuild and revitalize Gaza. All right, that's one sentence in the overall clause 15. Who's going to make sure weapons don't get in? Israel tried it before. There was tunneling underneath the border with Egypt. And yes, there was contraband that was actually flowed to the shore from the Mediterranean. And of course, there's Article 19. While Gaza redevelopment advances, and when the PA reform program is faithfully carried out, the conditions may finally be in place for a credible pathway to a Palestinian self-determination and statehood, which we recognize as the aspiration of the Palestinian people. So there are going to be a lot of conditions, but it can still happen. Okay, so what's missing? Right. Return to Oslo 1990s. Here we have a map. Actually, it was a Shalom Achshav map, Peace Now, where they're tracking certain settlements. Okay, a timeline for interim and permanent status agreements. We don't have that. And what was left for last, the Palestinian state, and what we talked about, not only the reforms, but Where's the map with borders? All that needs to be negotiated. And what government in Israel would be enticed to negotiate such borders? This government can't. It would fall apart. But this is well into the future, meaning that the government in power today doesn't really have to worry about this, because until there are reforms and the war in Gaza is over, will take at least a year and a lot longer. Who's responsible for security? Jerusalem is the dual capital, right? I mentioned that Ehud Barak in 2000 agreed to such a thing, certainly was leaning in that direction. And big question, can Jewish settlements remain in a Palestinian state if it was established in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank? And the big trade-off, ending Palestinian right of return to Israel for the same landmass that they had with the West Bank and Gaza, meaning 22% of what had been the British mandate when it ended in 1948. No Israeli annexations. And no less significant, of course, reform educational system, meaning that jihad is condemned and teaching peace, which is one of the biggest problems. Okay, Israel's international relations, will they get better? Everybody said, okay, once the conflict calms down, and Netanyahu himself said, listen, once we have a ceasefire, you'll see everything go back the way it was. Not exactly, but yes, things have lightened up a bit. Everybody expected it. The question is degree. How much? So, renewed support for the American Democratic Party? A bit more. I wouldn't say there's a lot. Everybody's waiting to see what happens. The MAGA isolationist types that don't particularly want to be involved in foreign affairs, I don't think they've moved very much. You know, they are led by, or have a lot of influence from Tucker Carlson. We'll get to him in a moment. The European Union, yes, things have improved somewhat. There were a lot of issues of boycotts about to be implemented, Eurovision, and these things were stopped. In other places, they're still moving, but very slowly. And the Anglo nations, right? We're speaking of Britain, Australia, Canada. Where is it going there? At the top, it seems like things are calmed down. We still have lots of other issues. Get to that in a moment with what's going on in the street. Now, what's one of the big issues here for Israel? Ukraine, okay? And the Europeans. Ukraine is a big buffer. That's why I have the map up here. Ukraine is over here if I go to the right, okay? Is a big buffer for Europe. They're afraid of the Russians. And Israel is giving a lot of not only technical support, but we're talking about technical military support for Europe. And Israel is a big supplier of arms, something like $14.8 billion just in 2024. So Israel's survival rests on being an asset. Of course, to be an asset to Europe is to be an adversary of Putin. So have to figure where you're going. Here's a picture of Netanyahu and Zelensky before the war and before the war between Ukraine and Russia. So the flames of anti-Israel, anti-Semitic activism, the question is, where does that go? Because on the governmental level, yes, it's had somewhat of an impact, somewhat. So let's take a look. Here's a big downside, the soft and moderate jihadi obstruction. You have here the Qatari financial influence with the leader of Qatar, Al Thani from the Al Thani family, right? Sheikh, a young guy, I don't think he's even 40 years old, and he is financing jihad worldwide. We know he financed ISIS, we know he financed Al Qaeda, and whenever there's a hostage deal, he's willing to finance, negotiate everybody's way out of it, and then he gives money to the jihadis to pay off the ransoms, which of course the Arab world at one point were ready to overthrow him because of that. But he's a good friend of Trump and this administration, which is a very big problem. Jihadis have been brought into the formula here. And of course, there's Erdogan. Turkey's the 8th largest military in the world and powerful, we're talking about. And he is a vicious anti-Semite. So you have two jihadis here. We know that Erdogan is as well, one with a massive military, another one with a very small country with massive amounts of money. And we know much of the anti-Semitism worldwide, especially in the West, is financed by Al Thani and the Qataris. And what's going on in the street. Anti-Semitism has not abated. It's gotten worse in many cases because your red-green axis is furious that there has been disagreement. After all, they were yelling for a ceasefire. They got one. Fighting stopped. That's not what they wanted. They wanted the destruction of the state of Israel. Now they're saying so outright. We'll be hearing about that in a moment. Okay. However, there'll be less in the massive demonstrations because there are those liberal types who are out there, well-meaning people that said, "Oh, there's far too much killing. We want all wars to stop." That type of person. And now that, okay, so there's a plan to stop it, they're not going to run out and start demanding Israel's destruction because that is not what they really wanted. They listened to the slogans that were put out by the extremists, and those slogans, in many cases, were seen as more moderate, even from the river to the sea. Many of them didn't understand exactly what was meant because they didn't know where the river was or the sea. Okay, so that group is gone. But those who remain are going to be even more intense in demands for Israel's obliteration, extermination. And the reason? They say Israel's oppressive, racist, colonial. It's going to become more extreme and more violent in the Anglo-European countries, meaning worldwide. You won't have these demonstrations in the Muslim and Arab world because those governments won't put up with it. Okay? So the anti-Zionist mask has been removed and the access will strengthen. And I want to make a comment here. You see Tucker Carlson, who is a hardline anti-Semite from the right, against Israel, say racist, and certainly Candace Owens is a racist. Never mind, right? From the African American community, doesn't matter, right? She hates Jews, she hates Israel, she wants destruction. And these forces from the right that are fascist, and I'd say even neo-Nazi, you'll be seeing they will be joining up with the red-green axis when it comes to destroying Israel. On other issues, they're not going to agree. So last step, will there be a neo-Nazi acceptability by the red-green axis? The Reds are going to have a problem with it, but not too much. The Greens won't have one at all. We'll see. That doesn't look good. And of course, the post-Trump Blair peace plan, they're going to show their true colors, as we said. And here there was a demonstration in London, scheduled for Saturday, the 11th of October, right before Trump arrived in Israel. And they knew what was going to happen. And they're going to continue the demonstrations. Let's hear what one of the leaders has to say.
Saturday, the 11th of October, is likely to be the largest pro-Palestine demonstration in UK history. We are going to be there with a bloc calling for a one-state Palestine, a free Palestine from river to sea, as a political objective, but also recognizing that we need a military force to actually achieve that, to actually dismantle the state of Israel, to actually defeat the IOF. We need a coalition of allied states to support the Colombian initiative, which is growing now, for a non-UN military force to actually stop the genocide and take on the genocidal, demonic state of Israel. I don't use that word demonic rhetorically. I mean, I cannot think of anything more representative of the devil himself than the IOF and the atrocities they continue to inflict every day. So we need to make visible this demand. We need to turn this idea of a free Palestine from river to sea into a political outcome. That'll start tomorrow with joining us on the demonstration.
And thank you very much. And we will get to your questions. Let's just move on.